Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into one of the most, tectonic shifts we've ever seen in global energy history. Today, we're focusing strictly on the historic May 1st, 2026 exit of the United Arab Emirates from OPEC and the broader OPEC Plus alliance. We're going to rely on the data and official statements to really drill down, pun totally intended, into the multi-layered reasons why the UAE decided to just walk away from the most powerful energy cartel in the world. To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this, just look at this number: 60 years. The UAE has been a foundational pillar of OPEC since the 1960s, helping to stabilize global markets and navigate countless geopolitical crises. For a 6-decade-long alliance to be severed virtually overnight, that's a massive shock to the global system. It literally rewrites the rules of the energy market. So, why do it? Okay, let's dive into this. If we look directly at the official announcement released by the UAE's Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure back on April 28th, the language they use is incredibly telling. They explicitly frame this exit around a sovereign responsibility in a new energy age. They're basically saying this decision reflects their direct national interest and the need to evolve their energy capacity. It was their official signal that they were finally departing from the cartel's constraints. Now, there's a quote here that I think captures the core motivation perfectly. The UAE fundamentally wants to break free. For years, they felt completely shackled by OPEC's restrictive production quotas. Abu Dhabi's leadership came to a really decisive conclusion. If they're going to secure their economic future and maximize their wealth in a rapidly changing world, they need total 100% sovereign control over how much oil they pump and sell. Let's start with the first major reason: the economic powder keg between their actual capacity and their assigned quotas. While the actual announcement in the spring of 2026 felt incredibly sudden to the rest of the world, this was an economic pressure cooker that had been quietly building for years. Now, what's really wild about the numbers here is the stark gap. The UAE's actual production capacity sits at nearly 4.85 million barrels per day, but under the OPEC Plus agreements, their output was heavily restricted. They were essentially forced to pump about 30% below what they were actually capable of doing. I mean, imagine owning a massive, state-of-the-art factory, but being told you're only allowed to run it at 70% capacity. And, that restriction stings even more when you consider this staggering figure: $150 billion. That is the massive amount of money the UAE recently poured into the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, specifically to boost their production capacity up to 5 million barrels a day. Having that much capital tied up in idle wells, simply because a cartel tells you to hold back, that became an immense and ultimately unacceptable financial frustration for them. Furthermore, the clock is ticking. The UAE is looking at the global energy transition and seeing credible projections that peak oil demand could hit by the end of this decade. So their calculus is super urgent and pragmatic. They need to monetize their vast oil reserves right now while global demand and the prices you pay at the pump are still high. They want to use that cash today to fund their transition into a diversified, AI-driven economy rather than leaving devalued assets stuck in the ground just for the sake of OPEC unity. That brings us to our second point: their diverging paths with Saudi Arabia. Look, economics don't exist in a vacuum, right? To really understand this exit, we have to look at the fundamental divide between the UAE and OPEC's de facto leader, Saudi Arabia. What we're dealing with here are two completely conflicting survival strategies. The UAE strategy is all about maximizing volume, pumping as much as possible to rapidly fund their economic diversification. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, desperately needs to restrict supply to keep global oil prices artificially high so they can fund their massive Vision 2030 domestic megaprojects. These two economic blueprints, they were just inherently on a collision course. Now let's move to the third factor: the geopolitical spark, the 2026 war. So all that economic tension was already there, but the devastating regional war that erupted in February 2026 between the US, Israel, and Iran, that acted as the ultimate catalyst. It essentially lit the fuse. The war threw global energy markets into absolute chaos. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively blockaded, roughly 8 million barrels a day of Gulf output was suddenly trapped. Brent crude skyrocketed past $111 a barrel. For the UAE, this blockade proved once and for all that OPEC's quotas were practically meaningless. I mean, you simply cannot coordinate global supply when your primary export route is quite literally a war zone. But here is where the UAE played its absolute trump card. Because of their unique geography and, honestly, their immense foresight in building infrastructure, they had a vital escape route that their OPEC neighbors largely didn't have, the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline. This specific pipeline is a real game changer because it bypasses the blockaded Strait of Hormuz entirely, ending safely at the Gulf of Oman. And it boasts a capacity of 1.8 million barrels per day. What this meant was, while other Gulf producers were completely trapped by the blockade, the UAE could theoretically still pump and export massive volumes. Exiting OPEC allowed them to utilize this geographical advantage at full throttle, without ever having to ask the cartel for permission. Let's move to our fourth and final factor, and see how this all builds into a major shift toward unilateralism. Beyond just the economics of oil, the 2026 war fundamentally shattered the UAE's trust in regional alliances entirely. During the conflict, the UAE absorbed a tremendous physical toll. They were reportedly hit by roughly 550 missiles and over 2,200 drones. Their prior diplomatic strategy of omni-alignment, trying to be friends with everyone, completely failed to protect them. Crucially, they felt profoundly abandoned by their Arab neighbors. The Gulf Cooperation Council provided some nice statements, sure, but effectively zero physical military backing when Emirati infrastructure was actively burning. This created a really stark contrast in Abu Dhabi's eyes. On one side, you have this failed Arab multilateralism, groups like the GCC and OPEC that demanded endless economic compromises from the UAE, but offered absolutely zero physical protection when it mattered. On the other side, you had bilateral security. During the war, Israel made a historic operational deployment of its Iron Dome system and IDF operators to successfully intercept projectiles and physically protect Emirati airspace. It basically hardened the Abraham Accords into a true functional military alliance. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate takeaway from all of this. The trauma of the war forced a very harsh realization. The UAE decided that if they alone have to bear the devastating physical costs of a regional conflict, well, they are absolutely done subverting their own economic potential just to please regional groups that don't even have their back. They chose right then and there to take complete control of their own destiny. Now, it's really important to note how they're officially positioning this. The UAE isn't trying to become some sort of rogue state. In their official release, they explicitly emphasize a balanced and forward-looking approach. They remain totally committed to market stability and bringing their massive oil production to the global market responsibly. The big difference? They're just going to do it entirely on their own sovereign terms, without a cartel dictating their limits. Which leaves us with this massive, lingering question. The UAE's exit was a highly calculated strike for sovereignty, driven by idle capacity, conflicting economic visions with Saudi Arabia, and the brutal realities of a regional war. But with its third-largest producer and arguably one of its only members with massive spare capacity, now operating completely independently, we really have to wonder, can OPEC maintain its grip on global oil, or is this literally the beginning of the end for the cartel? Thanks so much for joining me on today's Explainer. It's a truly fascinating shift, and we'll absolutely be watching closely to see how the market reacts from here.